Welcome, friends, to the 6th session of our seminar on the Secret Doctrine. In the previous session, we were examining the teaching of the law of cycles as it is portrayed in the proem of the Secret Doctrine. And we saw how this law of cycles applies to the universe, to the processes that go on in the universe on different scales, on different aspects. And now we can spend some more time trying to explore how this law of cycles affects, in particular, our daily life. Of course, our whole evolution is immersed or driven by this law of cycles. So our life is intrinsically affected by it. But let us see more specifically how we can observe the effects of cycles on our day-to-day life. Now, the first thing we should try to do is to understand why cycles are necessary. Because we could think, well, there is no need for cycles. There could be a line of progress, as we are usually accustomed to think of. A line of progress from something that is not developed to something that is developed. Why is this recurrence of cycles after cycles? But if we observe life, we will be able to see that actually there is no linear development in life. That's a very rare occurrence. When we go to school, for example, we learn certain things, but we are constantly recapping what we have learned before. And when we start we go to the next grade, for example, there is a recap of what was studied or learned before. Because it seems that when we recap, we are setting a different foundation. At the beginning of our studies, for example, the foundations that we had to set were very simple because we didn't know a lot of elements. Now, once we go through a certain learning and we go on to a new stage, then the foundation now can be more complex or can be higher or deeper, in whatever way you want to imagine this. The idea is that when we learn something and go by cycles, we can go from the simple to the more complex in a very organic way. We start without many details, we have a handle on the general view, and then we can go deeper into that study and add more details. And then in another cycle, we can go even deeper and expand our understanding. And that's how we learn for the most part. It may not be too evident, but if we pay attention, how do you learn math or whatever else? You learn the basis and then you go on and add on those bases. Cycles also allow fresh beginnings because as we, for example, take the life of a person, as we go through the experiences, we may learn many things, but at the same time, the experiences condition us. The pleasure and the pain that we suffered in the past will determine how we face again a similar situation when it comes to us. So as we grow older, we have the tendency to lose that freshness of approach to life. That is like the shadow of the experience. Experience is important, but it brings also conditioning. And if we are going to grow, we need to recreate structures. There is a point where the conditioning becomes more important than the experience, the ability to learn. So at that point, what is necessary is to break down the conditioning and begin again. Now, you can only break down what is, relatively speaking, less true. You know, between the understanding and the conditioning, the understanding belongs to a higher aspect of our being, the conditioning to a lower aspect of our being. So you can destroy the conditioning without destroying the understanding. So one of the cycles that we as human beings go through is a cycle of reincarnation. We have a life, a physical life, we acquire experience, but we acquire also conditioning. Our body begins to grow older, and at a certain point begins to be more of a hindrance than a help. So if there were not what we call death, then our body would become a prison for ourselves, for our consciousness. Because anything that is manifested has a beginning and an end, has a period of birth, development, and decay. So if we are not able to start over, then that body would be a prison. So death comes, there are certain processes at the level of consciousness, and then that consciousness takes on a new body. Of course, this new body will be the result of the previous one, but it's a fresh body. And through that body in particular, we can go on with our learning, with the learning at the level of consciousness. So cycles give us the opportunity to let go of all the things that begin to be carried over that we really don't need but are part of nature. So it's the opportunity to get rid of that when it becomes too heavy so that we can start or go on learning more. That's one aspect, and the other aspect is the one of allowing the learning in a gradual way, as we said at the beginning, forming foundations on different levels. So cycles are actually very smart ways to help the development of consciousness. Now, these cycles that we were discussing at the cosmic levels may be beyond our immediate perception. We don't know anything about rounds and chains and a cyclic universe in a direct way. But there are other cycles that we experience. Besides the cycles of day and night, the seasons, the sleeping and waking, etc., there are also some cycles that we could call psychological cycles. If we pay attention to the movement of our psyche, we will discover that many times we go through similar cycles, some periods of happiness, some periods of sadness, some periods of activity, some periods of rest. The idea in theosophy is that all these things are natural. You know, we always try to attain a state that is immutable. We want to be happy and that happiness stay forever. We want to be in a particular situation and that situation to go forever. But that's not how nature works. The fact that one of the fundamental laws of nature is this process of, or this law of periodicity, that shows us that it is impossible to extend something in time without it change. So without it changing. So the idea is that if cycles, changes, movement is inevitable, then we have to learn how to live within the cycle. Not to go against a universal law, expecting life never to change, expecting situations never to change. As we said, if that were the case, that would lead to stagnation. But that is not the case. So the more we cling to something constant, the more frustrated we will become because we cannot go against universal laws. So first, we could try to identify the cycles in our lives. There are natural cycles, in childhood and the teen years and adult, etc. But each one of these cycles allow us to go through a certain kind of experience and puts limits on a certain other kind of experience. When we are children, we enjoy of a certain kind of lack of responsibility, but we don't enjoy or cannot experience freedom. Freedom is something that comes as we grow older and take care of our own life. But along with that come other things, like responsibilities that we were talking about. So if while we are children, we are trying to be free, then we are going to be frustrated because the very cycle doesn't allow us to be free. Not that we should just bow our head and go with it, but we have to understand, as a kid, the kid cannot take care of himself, so necessarily has to be under the care and the rule of the adults. Now, when we are adults, we may long for the lack of responsibility that we had when we were children. But again, if we try to act in that way, we will suffer frustration and suffering and problems. So it is obvious that we have to learn how to adapt ourselves to the particular cycle we are going through. So sometimes even during our life in a particular cycle, let's say our life as adults, sometimes also we see that there are cycles where we are very busy, where we have constant activity. And then there are cycles where we don't have so many activities, cycles of rest, cycles of inactivity. And many times we resent whatever cycle we are in. When we are too busy, then we complain and we would like to have free time. And then when we have free time, we are bored and we say that we don't know what the purpose of our existence is, and then we want to be busy and to do something. So again, if we observe our life, we will see that there are different cycles, different periods of activities, periods of rest, periods of success, periods of failure, but they all pass. They all have a particular aim. They, just like being a child has a particular aim, being a teenager has a particular aim, etc. Every cycle has a particular aim. If we learn how to recognize the cycle and work within the cycle, then we can reap the most valuable experience from each one of the cycles. If we don't recognize the cycle and we keep trying to go against it, we only generate frustration and conflict and suffering. So within a particular cycle, it's not that we are absolute slaves. There is a certain freedom within a particular cycle. And we can exercise that freedom, but still we will be limited by the cycle in particular. So then we have also these psychological moods that I was mentioning. There are periods in our lives where we have a lot of inspiration and enthusiasm and energy and everything seems fine. And then there are some other periods in our life where everything seems gray or sad or boring. And our moods are constantly changing. Sometimes they change from one day to the next. Sometimes we are in cycles of moods that last for weeks or months or even years. But in any case, the cycle will always end. And again, if we can understand what that particular cycle is bringing and what the purpose of the cycle is, we can go along with this particular law. Because, for example, when we are going through a cycle that is not pleasant or that is more difficult, we usually complain. We think that there is something wrong with that kind of cycle, and we think that the normal, the natural state should be one of elation and happiness and joy and power to do things, etc. But many times the so-called good cycles are the most dangerous cycles from a spiritual point of view, more dangerous than what the cycles that we could call bad cycles. Because, for example, when everything is going fine, when we are given the power to act, when we are put in situations where we can express what we are, those are the cycles where we can make mistakes. You know, we are given power, and if we are just immersed in the cycle, enjoying the power, and not paying attention to the nature of this particular cycle, we may abuse the power, or we may abuse whatever we have. And that's what happens many times with human beings. Whether what is being given is power, money, relationships, or whatever it is. And it is during the cycles of affluence that we generate the seeds for the next cycles. So if we are not aware of this, if we are just drawn by the cycle of expansion and doing and ability to accomplish, and we don't pay a very deep attention to how we do things, then it is during the good cycles that we are generating the future suffering. While when we are going through cycles that they limit us, many times that limitation is a protection also. Of course, if we are talking about at the level of pleasure and pain, joy and sorrow, the good cycles are more pleasurable. But life is not about pleasure and pain. Pleasure and pain are very secondary considerations, although they are important in our lives, to our consciousness. They don't have any meaning. There are food or products that can produce a pleasure, and at the same time they are killing us. So pleasure and pain cannot be the measure for what is good or bad for us. So during the cycles that are not so pleasurable, we may be given actually a blessing in disguise. And every spiritual person says that it is during the dark cycles that we really grow and that we really develop. And the good cycles are more of a rest, although not very productive from a spiritual point of view stage. So for example, if we have to climb a mountain, when we are climbing the mountain is when we are actually moving forward. Now, climbing the mountain may be very difficult, and we are tired, and we are hurt, and we are hungry, but we are advancing. Now, when we stop, we take a break, we rest, that's a very pleasurable moment. And it's fine, it's necessary. But while we are resting, we are not moving. So the real productivity comes while we are moving, not while we are resting. So we can start seeing the cycles and trying to learn what particular cycle we are in, and trying to realize what is the right action within this particular cycle. And don't expect results that would be able to come in a different cycle. So just try to adapt yourself to this particular manifestation of the law and get the best out of it, so that the next cycle will be a higher cycle. Now, in all this particular approach, we are looking at ourselves, or we tend to look at ourselves as if we were suffering these changes, these cycles. But the truth is that we are not what can change. We are the immutable nature. Remember in the second fundamental proposition that we explored in the previous session, when Blavatsky begins to explain it, she doesn't begin by saying one of the universal laws is this law of periodicity. She doesn't begin in that way. She begins at saying that the Secret Doctrine affirms the eternity of the universe in toto as a boundless plane. So she starts by stating what is eternal, immutable, as a boundless, unlimited plane, which periodically witnesses these numberless universes. So she begins by referring to the real, and within the real, all this motion happens. So the main point, although we are talking about the law of periodicity, the hidden point that Blavatsky is making here is that this periodicity is part of the illusion, the thing that is not really real. And let me read a quote where Blavatsky says that in an explicit way. She says in The Secret Doctrine that the universe, the manifested universe, is called, with everything in it, Maya. And Maya is a Sanskrit word for illusion. Because all is temporary therein, from the ephemeral life of the firefly to that of the sun. Compared to the eternal immutability of the one and the changelessness of that principle, the universe, with its evanescent, ever-changing forms, must be necessarily, in the mind of a philosopher, no better than a will-o'-the-wisp. Yet the universe is real enough to the conscious beings in it, which are as unreal as it is itself. So what Blavatsky is saying here, everything that is part of the movement of evolution and cycles and etc. is really part of the illusion. Illusion not in the sense that it is just imagination. Illusion, as she says, in the sense that it is temporary. You know, for example, if a flower is something that is real or relatively real, but the flower will last a week. If you cling to the flower thinking that your life depends on the flower or on your enjoyment of the flower, then you are living in an illusion. Because the flower wasn't there a week before, and it's not going to be there a week after. So the universe is illusory in the sense that it is impermanent. So for example, if you are angry, I could ask, who are you? Are you this angry person? Let's say that somebody comes and gives you a piece of news. And he tells you something and you understand it to be something bad. Then you become angry or sad. When he sees your reaction, he realizes that you didn't understand because he is actually saying something good. So he explains again to you what he is really meaning, and you realize that this is a very good news. So you suddenly are happy. Now, who are you? Are you the person that was sad a second before? Are you the person that is happy now? Are you the person that will be who knows what in the next second? So, of course, we are experiencing all these different moods and feelings, but who is the permanent entity that is experiencing all this? So if we identify ourselves with a particular mood and we are angry, and we do something while we are angry that we will regret later, then when we are not angry anymore, we are suffering the consequences of our identification with something that was an illusion. Not illusion because we didn't feel it. Illusion because that state of anger was very temporary. It was something that we related to the moment. If you go back in your life, in the memory of your life, and you try to think how many times you were angry at things that now you don't even remember, or they are not even important. You know, when you were a kid, somebody came and said that your bicycle was ugly, and then you got very angry and started crying and maybe started a fight with the other child. And now you say, well, that was silly. Of course, we can understand it in a kid. But from a higher perspective, that's an illusion. So that's the point. When we are talking about cycles, we are really talking about what we are not. We are talking about our emotions, our feelings, our thoughts, the sensations. But the real in us is a ray of this immutable reality. It's the changeless nature of our being. So when we realize this, we begin to see that it is important in our life to begin to move from the periphery of our being that is constantly in motion to the center that is immutable, that is at peace. The more we identify with the periphery of our being, the more drawn we are in the chaos, in the motions, in the cycles. But as we come to the center, then we can witness all the cycles, which are inevitable, because cycles are part of the nature of the manifested universe and anything manifested in it. So we can witness the cycles, but we are not really affected by them. There is a quote. This is why it is important to always come back to this center, because there is a quote, for example, by Shankaracharya. He was one of or usually regarded as the founder of the Vedanta school of Hinduism. And he's talking about this eternal principle in terms of space, as we did in one of our previous sessions. So he says you have a jar, and you have the space of the jar. And he says the space is not affected with the smell of wine that is in the jar, by the contact with the jar. And in the same way, one's nature is not affected through contact with the things one identifies oneself with. So the same way that the space in a jar with wine is not really affected by the wine. And the walls of the jar, yes, they may smell. The air contained in the jar, if you throw the wine, the air may still smell, but the space is not affected, as we saw in the past. So he says, in the same way, our true self is not affected by the things we identify with, by positive emotions or negative emotions. Remember when we said the absolute doesn't evolve, because it's perfect in itself. So our true self doesn't evolve. The true self, in the sense of the ray of the absolute, is perfect in itself. Now, when we go one step below, then the process of evolution begins there. And we are going to discuss this in the next session. But the true self cannot be affected neither by positive or negative emotions, neither by moods of joy or sorrow. And it is coming back to this self constantly, to this true immutable center, that, as we saw in one of our previous sessions, it is by doing this that we can realize who we really are. So something like this was being pointed out by Krishnamurti in one of his lectures. Well, actually, this was a letter that he wrote to a friend. And he said, we are, most of us at least, creatures of moods and a variety of moods. We like this up and down state. We think this movement of moods is part of existence. But there are few who are not caught in this movement, who are free from the battle of becoming, so that inwardly there is a steadiness, not of the will, a steadiness that is not cultivated, nor the steadiness of a concentrated interest, nor the product of any one of these activities. This comes upon one only when the action of will ceases. So Krishnamurti is talking about this motion, this constant change in moods. And he says there are some that can touch this steadiness, which is spontaneous. It is there. It's not created. It's not generated. Because something that can be created can be also destroyed. Anything that begins will end because of this law of cycles that we are examining right now. So if something appears, whether it is the universe with the first logos, from the first logos down to the physical plane, or whether it is a thought, if it appears for the first time, it will also disappear. That's why when we were talking about the absolute, Blavatsky said, the absolute is not the first cause, because whatever comes first will also disappear at a certain point. So the absolute is the eternal background. So in this case, he's talking about a steadiness that is not the result of any kind of cultivation. It's not created. This is what we really are. Now the problem is that there are obstacles that don't allow us to experience this steadiness. The main one is the identification with what we are not. So this identification with the passing moods, with the situations, with our body, that identification with this produces all the anxiety. And this anxiety does not belong to the true or real nature. This anxiety is also part of the moods. The true nature is just the witness or the container of everything. We talked about this in our previous sessions, how when we can switch our identification from the content of consciousness, the content being a particular thought or feeling or action, to the container, to the space embracing everything, we can acquire this steadiness where there is only awareness of whatever is there, but without the identification. So what Krishnamurti is recommending here is that we try to realize this steadiness in ourselves. Now he doesn't say try to produce a calm state of mind, for example. Whether it is by repeating mantras or by trying to meditate or by trying to distract yourself. You can do those things, but the quiet mind that you produce will be broken. That quietness will be broken because it was produced, and as these cycles, you will get to a point where there is restlessness. Now, if you can realize that eternal immutability, that eternal steadiness, then that steadiness in itself is never going to change. Of course, at the beginning, when we are trying to recognize this steadiness, it will look like the steadiness disappears, but what really happens is that we lose touch of it or with it. You know, we were aware of this, and then we identify with anything in the change in life, and then we forget about it. But it's not really that the steadiness disappeared, it's that we stop experiencing it. Now, for most people, you know, Krishnamurti, as a mystic, usually talked about the more absolute approach. He didn't like to talk about means to get to a certain point, because means, cause and effect are all within the realm of the relative, of the manifested, of the change in nature. So he always tries to point out to a realization of the eternal, of the absolute, without means. Now, for most people, this is difficult. And I would say that in many cases it is it's not possible, or the odds are not with the possibility of realizing this state when there is no order in our nature. You know, if we are angry, it is very difficult to feel love. Now, if we calm down our anger, that is not going to make us feel love necessarily. But the calming down of anger seems to be a prerequisite to have the possibility of feeling love. So I think some of the means that we can use to generate, for example, in this case, steadiness, although they are not producing or they are not bringing the real steadiness, they can be useful to put a certain order in our nature. But then to realize the real steadiness, we need something more. We need this deep understanding that, according to Krishnamurti, since we are using his quote, comes out of a state of choiceless awareness, which is not different from what we were discussing in previous sessions about being the space and this state of awareness. So there are some means that we can use. For example, when we are caught in a particular mood or even in a particular situation, one typical feeling that comes with it is that that particular mood or situation will last forever. You know, if somebody would come and tell us in the midst of a difficult situation, would come and tell us, I can assure you that next week everything will be solved, then in most people the mood would completely change, and the person would have a lot of strength to go through the difficult situation, knowing that it's bound to stop, it's bound to change. But when we are in the situation, first, we don't know the future, and second, we have the feeling that it will be eternal. We don't have the feeling that it will end at a certain point. So a first practice is to try to remain aware that everything is changing, that everything is cyclic. And as I said before, not only when we are going through a difficult cycle, but also when we are going through a good cycle. Not that we should not enjoy the good cycle, not that we should be negative people saying, I can't enjoy this because this is going to end. That attitude shows that we are still within the realm of changing moods. But when we understand that everything that is presented to us is temporary, then that very understanding moves us back to that eternal or that immutable aspect of our being. And from that immutability, we can relate in a much better way to any kind of cycle, whether sorrowful or joyful. Because when going through a certain difficult cycle, we still keep in touch with that inner center, which is in peace. And of course, no difficult cycle is pleasurable. It's not going to produce pleasure. And when we are in it, we are not going to like it. But the more we identify with the pure aspect of our being, the more external that suffering feels. And then when we are in a good cycle, we also know that that cycle will end. But the fact that we know that, again, will retreat us to the point that is beyond cycles, beyond attachments, and then we will be able to enjoy it without fear of the future. Because many times we cannot enjoy the good things because we are afraid that something will go wrong, or because we are attached to it, or for whatever reason. But if we can go through a good experience with equanimity, then that allows to a different kind of joy, a purer joy, which is devoid of fear, attachment, etc. And as I said, when we are aware of all these things, we are not caught in the cycle, in the particular cycle. If it is a bad cycle, we are not caught in depression, although we may feel sad if something, difficult is going on, but we are not going to be plunged in depression. Or when it is a good cycle, we are not going to become unconscious of our limitations and do things that then we are going to regret. So a first practice to begin to recognize the different cycles and be free from the cycles is to remember that they are not permanent. So once we remember they are not permanent, we can say, okay, what the right action is. We can try to determine the right action in that particular cycle. It is a cycle of rest, of inactivity, of darkness, or not being prominent. Well, that's the time to develop humility, patience, quietness, to go to introvert, to look inside, to develop endurance, courage. If it is a cycle of activity and production, well, that's a time to develop our skills, to be of service, to whatever the cycle in particular allows. So identifying the cycle and recognizing that it is limited allows us to have a more rational and more intelligent relationship with the particular periods of life we go through. Then another practice that is useful in this endeavor to come back to the center is that of always reminding us that we are the eternal and the changeless. So, for example, I have a quote by Annie Besant where she recommends to think about this every day for a few minutes. She says, we must make it part of our daily thought. Let us give 1 minute or a couple of minutes in the morning to this definite recognition. I am the changeless, the eternal self. We are constantly identifying with our personality, as I mentioned several times. So this reminder, I am the changeless, the eternal self, with a deep understanding of what this means, has a very important effect in our daily life. If we just think, I am the changeless and eternal self, and when you say I, you are thinking of the personality, then you are fooling yourself. First, you are not understanding what this really means. And second, you are misleading yourself. When it says I, it is not referring to the changing I. It is referring to the real I, which is beyond the changing I. The problem is that we are identified with this constantly changing I, with the thoughts and emotions and body of this I. So when we say, I am the changeless and eternal, that means I am not this. I am not the thinker. I am not the feelings. I am not this body. They may be instruments of expression for the real, but it means I am not this. In the New Age, many times these kind of meditations are turned into affirmations, and they say, I am divine, I am this, and that is just an artificial expansion of the illusory self, because they are thinking, I, the illusory self, am real. And that's the basis of what is called in the East avidya, ignorance. The basis of the ignorance that keep us caught in suffering is to think that what is, like Patanjali defines it, for example, what is impure, what is always changing, what is unreal, so that's a description of the personality, to think that that is pure, it's eternal, and it's real. That is the basic ignorance. So the spiritual path tries to break that ignorance. So if you repeat this as an affirmation and say, oh, I am eternal and powerful, and then you are doing the opposite that is supposed to do. So in repeating, I am changeless, the eternal self, what you have to do is to realize, therefore I'm not what changes. So there are some meditations in which you can actually begin to realize who you really are by using this particular aspect, the quality of changing that the unreal has. Because, for example, we all think that we are the same person from our birth to now. You know, I'm Pablo, and whatever changes happened to me, they all happened to me. I have this continuous sense that I am. So even though my body is very different from the baby and my thoughts and emotions are all very different, somehow I feel that I am the same. So one meditation is to try to discover what in us is changeless. Because as we were seeing, the real is beyond change. If it changes, then it is not the real. Because change implies distraction. Change implies limitation. Something can change when it is limited. So it changed from one form to the other. But whatever is absolute cannot change. As we saw in one of the previous sessions, the absolute is immutable. So let's see our body. Our body obviously changes. If our sense of being were based on the body, if our sense of identity were based on the body, then the sense of identity of the child Pablo would be completely different from the sense of identity of the adult. So we are not the body. Then what about the emotions? If our being were based on the emotion, then again, I would have a completely different sense of identity when I'm angry or when I'm joyful, because those are two completely different emotions. But yet, I feel I'm the same person that was at one time angry and now is happy, because I feel that I am beyond that. Those things are affecting me, but are not me. The same can be said with thoughts, with thinking. Our thoughts are constantly changing, and yet we feel we are the same. So why do we feel we are the same? Who is the same? If it is not thoughts, if it is not emotions, if it is not the body and the sensations, who am I that is not changing? Why do I have this sense that I am always there? Maybe it's an illusion. If we observe and inquiry about, and make an inquiry about this, we can see that maybe memory is producing this sense of continuity. Because I remember the experiences of the child Pablo, and I assume that I'm the same because I remember that. So maybe memory is the one that is keeping this sense of identity. But even in cases where people lose their memories, you can see that, yeah, that is partially true because they don't remember who they are. But still, they know that they are. They may not know who they are, but they know that they are. So there is a feeling of being which is always there. It was in the child, whether he was, younger or older. It was in the child whether he was angry or happy. It was in the child whether he thought one thing or the other. And then in the teenager and the adult, and whether we have memory or not, there is this feeling I am that is always there. So many traditions recommend to meditate on this constant feeling of I am. Not I am Pablo, because again, I am Pablo depends on memory. If I lose my memory, I don't remember my name, I don't remember my past, I don't remember my studies or my psychological features, I don't know I'm Pablo, but I know that I am. So many traditions recommend a meditation on that sense of I am. And that sense of I am appears as you discard everything that you are not. So for example, you are meditating and then you say, okay, sensations are constantly changing. So let us forget about the sensations. Let us take our sight off the sensations and see what is left. Well, you have emotions and thoughts. Okay, we see that the emotions are constantly changing. So let us disregard them and let us see what is left. So we see all this thinking and we see that the thinking is also changing. Then you say, okay, therefore I'm not the thinking. And you disregard it. So when you cannot act because you disregarded the physical body and the sensations, when you don't feel, when you don't think, what is left there? If you actually do it, you see that there is left a state of awareness, which is at the same time a sense of being. That is not being produced by anything. Thinking is produced. You can think of the food that you are going to eat. You can think of a previous experience. It is being produced. Same with emotions or actions. When you drop everything, there is something that is left that you didn't produce, that you don't control, you as the thinker. There is something that is left that is this silent state of awareness, which is at the same time being. It is that sense of I amness, which is silent, not the thought I am, but the sense. You will see that there is a sensation of being, of I amness, if you want to call it that way. So meditating on this, trying to dwell on this silent sense of being, is a way to begin to be aware of this uncreated steadiness. So that the more, of course, we are bound to lose it, because we are still identified with what we are not. But the more we visit it, the more we visit this state of being, where there is no particular action, where there is no duality, the more we visit this state, the more it becomes part of our normal awareness. So this is what I think Krishnamurti is referring to. And although, as I said, he doesn't like to talk about means, in many traditions, means are offered as helps. As I said, they cannot produce the real experience, but if we do it in an intelligent way, they can clear out the obstacles so that the real perception appears. Even Krishnamurti said, if you have a room and it's cluttered, and you cannot even open the window, then the breeze is not going to come in. So the first thing you have to do is to put in order your room so that you can open your window. Now the act of opening the window will not produce the breeze. The breeze may come or may not, but you need to open the window if the breeze is going to come on its own. So I think all these different techniques are the putting in order of the room. And if we do it in the right way and we can open the window, one day the breeze may come in. So this is more or less what I wanted to share about the concept of cycles as applied to our daily life and our spiritual practice. We are going to see in the next session that these cycles are actually, since they are an intrinsic part of nature, they are imposed, if we want to see it in that way, on us. We cannot choose whether to enter into a cycle or not. Blavatsky calls them the cycles of necessity. But as we were seeing, we can learn how to retreat to what we really are so that we can witness the inevitable cycles, learn from them whatever is necessary, and still be free from the influence of these cycles.